A woman stood before a Michigan judge in 1999 and wrote 5 words that should have been impossible to ignore. She wrote, "There could be an accident." She was not describing a fear. She was quoting her husband directly, a man named Brian Hooker, who had told her by her own sworn account not to mess with him, or those exact words would come true. That woman was Brian Hooker's second wife. Her name was Elizabeth, and she is dead now. But the documents are not. Brian Hooker's third wife, Lynette, disappeared from their sailboat in the Bahamas in April 2025. Her body has never been found. Named sources. Confirmed contacts. Court records reviewed on the record. Every fact in this episode verified before presentation. That is the standard, and that standard holds. 26 years passed between the night Elizabeth Hosef wrote those words in a Kent County, Michigan courthouse and the night Lynette Hooker was last seen alive in the open water of the Bahamas. 26 years between one woman's sworn account of a man who threatened her with an accident and a second woman who vanished in circumstances her husband has described, in almost identical language, as exactly that, an accident. This is what a pattern looks like across 3 decades and 3 marriages. If this case matters, and it should, subscribe now. Every episode in the Lynette Hooker series is documented here, and the reporting is accelerating. New developments are coming. This channel will cover every one of them as they arrive. Before the Bahamas. Before the sailboat. Before the word missing became the only word that mattered, there was Lynette. Lynette Hooker was the kind of person who made other people feel immediately at ease. Friends describe her warmth first, her laugh second, the specific kind of stubbornness that belongs to a woman who has decided something and will not be moved from it, in the best possible sense of the word. She was not someone who folded quietly. She was not someone who disappeared into a relationship without leaving traces of herself behind. She had a daughter named Carly, and the relationship between them was the kind that defies easy description. Mother and daughter, yes. But also confidants, allies, 2 people who talked on Fridays about whatever the week had brought. The kind of relationship where one Friday phone call about life problems feels completely unremarkable because those conversations were always happening. The last time Carly heard her mother's voice was a Friday. Lynette was helping her with something. It was an ordinary call. It ended the way ordinary calls end. Lynette Hooker was not heard from again. She had agreed to something extraordinary, the kind of life most people only sketch out on paper in the back of their minds and never actually build. Retirement on the water. A 50-foot sailboat. The Gulf of Mexico, the Florida Keys, the open Bahamas. The vessel was named Soulmate. Consider what that name was supposed to mean. Consider what it now means. She was last seen alive on the night of April 4, 2025, in the dark water off the Abaco Islands in the Bahamas. The man with her in the dinghy was her husband, Brian Hooker. He says she fell overboard. He says he could not find her. He says the darkness took her and she was gone. Brian Hooker was placed in custody by Bahamian authorities within days. He was held for 5 full days. He was questioned twice in what were described as stringent sessions. He was released only when the legal clock in the Bahamas expired, at 21 minutes past 7 on a Monday, a deadline that was not a coincidence of scheduling but the hard outer limit of what Bahamian law permitted. Within 24 hours of that release, Brian Hooker left the Bahamas and returned to the United States. He has been publicly silent since. The 50-foot sailboat named Soulmate is currently docked at the United States Coast Guard Station in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. It has been seized. It has been searched. Investigators processed it as a crime scene. Among the items recovered was a device containing GPS data. Data that, according to confirmed reporting, does not match the location Brian Hooker provided for where Lynette went overboard. These are the facts on record. But new facts have now emerged. Facts that begin not in the Bahamas but in a Michigan courthouse, in a document filed by a woman who is no longer alive, in language that should have served as a warning long before April 4th. Brian Hooker has been married 3 times. The first marriage, beginning in 1989, was to a woman named Deborah. They were wed at the 29 Palms Marine Corps Base in California, the largest United States Marine installation in the world. That marriage produced 2 children and ended after approximately 4 years. Those children are now adults. The second marriage was to a woman named Elizabeth Hosef. Elizabeth Hosef died in 2024 at the age of 64. She is no longer alive to tell her story in full. But what she did while she was alive was write it down, in a sworn court filing in her own handwriting, in front of a Michigan judge. The Daily Mail obtained those court documents from Kent County Circuit Court in Grand Rapids, Michigan. What those documents contain is extraordinary, not because the language is extraordinary on its own, but because of what that language now rhymes with. Elizabeth Hosef filed not one but two applications for a personal protection order against Brian Hooker during their divorce proceedings in the late 1990s. The first application was not initially granted, reportedly on a technicality. The second was. She had filed for divorce within 2 years of their marriage. Within 2 years. In her filing, Elizabeth Hosef wrote that in a recent telephone conversation, Brian Hooker had told her not to mess with him. She wrote that he told her there could be an accident. She wrote that she tried to get him to elaborate. And then she wrote what he said when she pushed. He said, "Everyone knows how I am. There could be an accident." Stop there. Read that again slowly. Everyone knows how I am. There could be an accident. Now hold those two sentences against what Lynette Hooker's daughter Carly has said publicly about what her mother told her in 2024, the year Lynette briefly left Brian Hooker and came back to Florida. Carly has said, on the record and in on-camera interviews, that her mother told her Brian Hooker choked her, that he threatened to kill her, that he specifically threatened to throw her overboard so that nobody could find her. 2 women, 2 marriages, decades apart. The method changes. The threat does not. In her personal protection order application, Elizabeth Hosef wrote the following. During the course of our marriage he drank, indulged in pornography and was verbally, emotionally and physically abusive to me. I've been kicked, pushed down, spat on by him. He also during his rages would destroy things such as rocking chairs, telephones. My walls have plenty of marks left by him. He was also verbally and emotionally abusive to my first 2 children from my first marriage. She then added, he is also a thief. He took the equity check from my house, forged my signature, cashed it and kept the money. Those are allegations. They were not adjudicated in a criminal court. But they were filed under oath in a personal protection order application that a Michigan judge ultimately granted. They are public record. They exist. Ask yourself at what point a pattern of sworn allegations across multiple marriages, separated by decades, involving different women, describing the same underlying behavior, stops being coincidence and becomes a record. The man who found those documents is Greg Woodfield, a reporter with the Daily Mail who has covered the Lynette Hooker disappearance since the earliest days it became public. Woodfield is not a newcomer to high-profile missing persons cases. His history on this story predates the current burst of attention. He covered the Gabby Petito case and has appeared on multiple platforms as a reporter with boots-on-the-ground access that most outlets have not matched. He has made multiple trips to both the Bahamas and Michigan specifically to dig into the life and history of Brian Hooker. The Michigan trips, in particular, represent a commitment to document-level reporting that required physical presence, not just database access. Woodfield spoke on record about how he found the documents, why they had not surfaced before, and exactly what they reveal. He began with context that most viewers following this case will not have encountered. Brian Hooker's marriage history has 3 chapters, not 1. The first wife, Deborah, lives in the Grand Rapids area. Woodfield approached her at her home and described her as a pleasant, charming woman who declined to say anything about Brian Hooker, not with hostility, simply without comment, including nothing about their background together. Those 2 children from that first marriage are adults. One lives in Grand Rapids, one lives on the West Coast. The second marriage, to Elizabeth Hosef, was where the court record begins. That was clearly a very, very unhappy marriage, Woodfield said on record. Within 2 years, Elizabeth was filing for divorce, and she was also very concerned about her personal safety. He then explained why those documents had remained largely invisible until now. Normally, we can go online and pull up the documents and purchase them online, Woodfield said. I actually had to go to Grand Rapids to go and pick up these documents. At Kent County Circuit Court, you have to buy the documents either by your own personal check or a money order. The first lot of documents I got, I UPS'd some details, the ones that I wanted. They didn't all come back to me, so I went up to Grand Rapids and got them. Think about what that means. These documents were not sealed. They were not hidden behind legal protections. They were sitting in a county courthouse in Michigan, accessible to anyone willing to show up in person and pay. The reason they had not appeared in prior reporting is not that anyone was keeping them from the public. It is that nobody had gone to look. Woodfield found them because a court clerk, during a prior visit, mentioned almost in passing that there were a couple of personal protection order applications on file. That is the kind of detail that gets missed unless a reporter is physically present and asking the right questions. That would explain why we haven't seen them until now, Woodfield said. They were sort of difficult to get. He then addressed the content of the filings with specificity. Crucially, she claimed that he threatened her with an accident, Woodfield said. In this filing that she wrote, in her handwriting, she said, "In our most recent telephone conversation he suggested that I not mess with him or there could be an accident." And then she wrote, "I tried to get him to elaborate. He just says, everyone knows how I am. There could be an accident." Woodfield noted that the same language appeared in the second filing, reinforced rather than softened in Elizabeth Hosef's second attempt at a protection order. In the second filing she wrote, "I have many reasons to consider his threat real." Woodfield addressed directly the parallel between what Elizabeth filed in 1999 and what Lynette's family has described about the years leading up to April 4, 2025. "A lot of the allegations about his life with Lynette have a striking similarity to what was outlined in those court documents with Elizabeth," he said. And of course, being in court documents gives a little bit more credence than just someone saying something. That credence is not a minor detail. In a case built on circumstantial evidence, as any nobody homicide case must be, the difference between a verbal allegation and a sworn court document is the difference between a story and a record. The 50-foot sailboat named Soulmate is docked at the Coast Guard station in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. It is not there because of a mechanical issue or a routine inspection. It is there because it is, for the purposes of this investigation, the best available crime scene. The ocean where Lynette Hooker was last seen cannot be processed for forensic evidence. Investigators cannot collect DNA from open water. They cannot lift fingerprints from the Atlantic. They cannot recover hair or fiber from the Bahamian current. But they can process the boat. Among the items recovered when investigators first came aboard was a device containing GPS data. That data, according to confirmed reporting, does not align with the location Brian Hooker told authorities Lynette went into the water. The discrepancy was significant enough to generate a second search operation, in which divers went back to the Bahamas and searched a different area of water than the one Brian Hooker had described. Tick-tock. They found nothing. That is not evidence of innocence. That is evidence of how water disposals work, a point that will be addressed in full shortly. Greg Woodfield addressed the GPS finding and what it produced. "That was one of the things that sparked the responsibility for that second search earlier this year," Woodfield said, when divers searched a slightly different area of the water, where Brian said he was when Lynette went missing in one area. This GPS information might have suggested somewhere different. And they didn't find anything more. So they are back to square one in many respects. Square one is not the same as nowhere. Investigators authorized a second search because the GPS data was specific enough to reframe the location of the incident. That requires a meaningful discrepancy, not an approximation error, not a rounding issue, but a directional departure from the account Brian Hooker gave of where he was and what happened. Woodfield also addressed the chain of custody question that surrounds the boat's seizure. "When it was in Fort Pierce," he said, "the investigators swarmed on board. They took a lot of stuff. That was their big opportunity to go through that thing with a fine-tooth comb. And they did. They got a device with some GPS data on it, which cast doubt on where Brian said he was. The Soulmate's own navigation systems recorded something that does not match Brian Hooker's story. That is not a witness account. That is not a family member's recollection. That is the vessel's own data. Ask yourself what it means when the boat tells a different story than the man who was on it. Carly Allsville is Lynette Hooker's daughter. She is the person in this story with the deepest record, the longest knowledge of her mother's relationship with Brian Hooker, the most direct access to what Lynette told her about the deterioration of that marriage, and the most personal stake in what this investigation ultimately produces. She has cooperated with authorities. She has traveled to the Bahamas herself to retrace the route Brian Hooker claims he and Lynette traveled that night. She has spoken publicly, repeatedly, and consistently without contradiction. She spoke on record about what first made her suspicious of Brian Hooker, and the timeline her account establishes is essential context. For one, she said, he's already made this threat 2 years ago, that this exact thing was going to happen to her. That he would make sure this would happen to her. He's threatened it multiple times and has done actions to her that have hurt her. So the fact that this is happening now is kind of coincidental, or it's just funny, because you said that you were going to do this and now it's happening. So why wouldn't I just believe your story? I would need more answers than just believing your story at this point. She was asked specifically about 2024, about what her mother told her during the period when Lynette left Brian Hooker and came back to Florida. 2 years ago in 2024, Carly said, I went to go visit her in Florida and she told me that he choked her out and threatened to kill her and throw her overboard so that nobody could find her. She then immediately left after that fight. But then she eventually went back a couple months later. Hold that last sentence. She left. And then she went back. This is not an unusual pattern in abusive relationships. It is, in fact, one of the most documented patterns in the literature on domestic violence. A cycle of departure and return that is not weakness, not confusion, but the predictable result of a relationship in which abuse and affection exist in the same space. Understanding that cycle is essential to understanding why Lynette Hooker was on that dinghy on the night of April 4th. Carly was also asked about what Brian Hooker was like in person, before the disappearance, in the time when she was around him. "He can be very charming, outgoing, knows how to talk to people," she said. "But when he gets irritated, he can be kind of smartassy and just a dick, basically. There are two sides of him, really. Two sides." That description, public charm, private edge, maps almost exactly onto what Greg Woodfield found in the court documents about Elizabeth Hosef's marriage. A man capable of presenting himself as competent, engaging, and personable, while simultaneously carrying a documented history of rage, physical violence, targeted threats, and financial manipulation. Carly also described the last conversation she had with her mother. It was a Friday. The Friday before Lynette disappeared. Lynette was helping her with something. It was not a farewell. It was not a conversation weighted with premonition or unusual feeling. It was a mother and a daughter talking the way they always talked. That conversation happened. It ended. And it was the last one. Tad Tobias is a specialist in prosecuting what the legal system calls nobody homicide cases. Cases in which a body has never been recovered, and investigators must construct a murder prosecution entirely from circumstantial evidence. This is one of the most specific and demanding areas of criminal law, and Tobias represents one of the most authoritative voices on how these cases are built, how they go to trial, and why they succeed or fail. His analysis carries particular weight in the Lynette Hooker case because that is almost certainly the legal territory this investigation will have to navigate. Tobias spoke on record about what a prosecution without a body actually requires, what the known facts in this case already establish, and where the critical vulnerabilities and strengths lie. He began with the core challenge of the nobody case, and then explained in specific terms why this case is different from most. "Generally, nobody murder cases are hard to get to trial," Tobias said, "because you often don't know when the murder happened, where the murder happened, or how the murder happened. Yet in this case, interestingly, we don't know how the murder happened exactly, but we do know where and we do know when. So ordinarily I would say anytime I'm faced with a prospect of a nobody prosecution, I say yeah, it can be very difficult to get to trial. But in this case I think it's a lot easier because you have some significant evidence that you don't ordinarily have." Think about what that means in practical terms. The category of nobody homicide typically presents a prosecutor with three unknowns: the when, the where, and the how. Remove two of those unknowns, and Brian Hooker himself removed them by telling investigators his own account of where and when Lynette went into the water, and the prosecution's task narrows considerably. "By his own admission, he was the last person to see her," Tobias said. "By his own admission, she went into the water. So you have a lot of this information you don't ordinarily have." He was then asked about the GPS discrepancy specifically, whether an inconsistency between Brian Hooker's stated account and the vessel's navigation data constitutes probable cause for an arrest. "I think it's enough probable cause for arrest," he said. "I don't think they have enough yet to build a case beyond a reasonable doubt. There's obviously differences between those two things. I think in this case they likely have probable cause." But Tobias also made a distinction that matters. A distinction that explains why no arrest has yet been made, and why a careful prosecutor moves at a tempo that can feel frustratingly slow. Before signing off on an arrest warrant, he said, "A prosecutor needs to know not just what evidence points toward guilt, but what evidence, if any, points away from it. You want to make sure you're truthful in front of the court," Tobias said. "You're not hiding anything from the court. And the court looks at it and signs off and says, yeah, arrest this guy. And then they find out the prosecutor and the police knew this information that pointed away from the suspect. They're not going to be happy about that." He called it information inconsistent with guilt, the existence of any explanation that could account for the GPS discrepancy without requiring criminal intent. A power outage. An equipment malfunction. An innocent reason the navigation system went offline at a critical moment. You don't want to move forward on a case if you know there's something in the background that says, hey, maybe he didn't do this, Tobias said. You want to continue your investigation and say, let's really lock down whether what we think is true is actually true. Tick-tock. Tobias then addressed the probability of a successful prosecution if Lynette's body is never found. His answer drew on specific data from a category of cases that is larger than most people realize. 54% of all nobody murder cases that have gone to trial have involved domestic relationships between the two people, Tobias said. Husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, parent, child. So in those cases, in a missing persons case, nobody murder, it's kind of obvious. If I'm a husband and my wife, if I kill my wife, what's the smartest thing I can do? Get rid of the body. Because I'm the number one suspect. If they come to my house and my wife is dead there and I'm there, that's really bad. If I can somehow get rid of the body, I'm going to take suspicion off myself. And then the most significant statistical detail in his entire analysis. The number one place that bodies are disposed of in nobody murder cases, when we can learn either after the case or from the evidence in the case, the number one place is water disposal. Because it makes sense. That is the most difficult place to recover a body. You can't use a canine on the ocean. Consider what those two facts establish together. The majority of nobody murder prosecutions involve domestic relationships. The most common method of body disposal in those exact same cases is water. This case has both. By Brian Hooker's own account, his wife went into open ocean water and was not recovered. By his own account, he was the only other person present. Tobias anchored this to a real case so the framework does not remain abstract. There's a very famous case out of Delaware, he said, involving a defendant named Tom Capano, who ended up killing his girlfriend, a woman named Marianne Fahy, and he put her in an igloo cooler and eventually successfully sank the cooler. She was never found even though she was inside a cooler, somewhat protected from the elements. And so it is not at all uncommon to have these water disposals where there is never anybody found. He also addressed the question that hangs over every element of Brian Hooker's conduct since Lynette disappeared, the immediate departure from the Bahamas silence, the absence of any sustained public effort to continue searching for her. If your wife goes missing and you did it, Tobias said, you need to go on every search. You need to make it look like you care where she is and what happened. And for the reason that they know it's futile, because they know they've killed the person, they never do it. You almost never have a nobody murderer spending significant amounts of time looking for the missing person. Brian Hooker told people he was going to stay in the Bahamas. He told people he would not leave until he found Lynette. Within 24 hours of his release from Bahamian custody, he was on a plane back to the United States. He has not returned. Blaine Stevenson is a liveaboard sailor who knew Brian and Lynette Hooker through the shared community of people who live their lives on the water. He and his wife socialized with them. He describes Lynette with warmth and clarity. He is also the person who recorded a phone call with Brian Hooker in the days after Lynette disappeared, a recording that was eventually made public, as Stevenson explains, not to implicate Brian Hooker but because Brian was in Bahamian custody and unable to help coordinate a search, and Stevenson wanted the audio of Brian's account of the incident available so people could search the right areas while there was still time. What he heard on that call, and what he now understands in retrospect about the man he befriended, are two separate things. He spoke on record about both. The flares were the thing that just didn't make sense to me, Stevenson said. The life vest being in the dinghy, it was the way he said it. I know it was my initial thought of what is this. When he said we weren't wearing life vests, I understand that we don't always wear life vests. And then he goes, but we have the two that the Coast Guard requires that are under, and my brain is like, the Coast Guard requires like you had two life vests. And then he gets to a point where he talks about the sun setting, and the sun hadn't set yet, so that wasn't jibing with my knowledge of living on the water. He said it was dark, he couldn't see her. And I was trying to play the movie out in my head as a visual learner and I couldn't put the pieces together as he described them. Stevenson was explicit that he was not, at that point in the phone call, certain of anything beyond one fact. The story did not work. When a person with genuine experience on the water tries to construct a visual sequence from what Brian Hooker described, the timing, the light, the life vests, the flares, the moment she went over, the sequence does not hold together. He confirmed what multiple other sources have noted about the weather. I've talked with 3 captains in our boater circle that were there, Stevenson said, and a homeowner I trust who is also a boat owner, that say that night the weather got bad. But we've now seen videos, still footage, security cameras of the area at the time of incident. And we can see that it hadn't gotten bad yet. I think it is important to note that the weather did get bad later. But it wasn't that bad at the time of the incident. He said the incident took place. What that means is this. Brian Hooker described conditions, waves, wind, darkness, visibility, that match what the weather became, not what the weather was at the moment he claims Lynette went overboard. Consider what it means if a person describes the wrong weather for the moment they claim an accident occurred. Ask yourself how a person remembers the weather wrong for the worst moment of their life. Stevenson also spoke to Brian Hooker's personality and social media behavior in the years before the disappearance. Observations that are worth noting not as evidence of anything, but as character context. "He was definitely the most political person I had in my entire feed," Stevenson said. "We're talking the last 4 years of election and whatever American chaos was going on. It just got to a point where I just didn't want to see it anymore. There were a couple of times I tried to agree with his position from a different angle in a comment, but he would just shut it down. He was aggressive. His point is his point." He confirmed what has been reported about the period when Brian and Lynette temporarily separated. "My wife had the messages," he said, of the communication from Lynette during that break. This is just going to be paraphrasing, but that he got bad. He was angry that they had spent their life together, but she couldn't cruise with him anymore and be alone on a boat with him. She could not be alone on a boat with him. Read that phrase in the context of everything else this episode has established. Read it alongside what Elizabeth Hosef wrote in that Michigan courthouse in 1999. Read it alongside what Carly says her mother told her in 2024. And then read it in the context of where Lynette Hooker was on the night of April 4, 2025, alone on a dinghy in the dark in the Bahamas, with a man she had temporarily left and then returned to. Stevenson made a point in his interview that should not be allowed to slip past. It is easy, natural even, for a case like this to narrow down until it becomes entirely about the suspect. About the investigation. About what charges might eventually be filed and when. Stevenson pushed back against that. "Brian's sucking the oxygen out of Lynette's air right now," he said. "She's the one missing. This really doesn't have anything to do with Brian anymore. There is a missing person in the Bahamas regardless of how she got there. Can we please get permission to search?" That question has not been answered to the family's satisfaction. As of this episode, the investigation is active across multiple jurisdictions. The United States Coast Guard holds the soulmate at Fort Lauderdale. Federal investigators have characterized this as a murder investigation. The Royal Bahamas Police Force continues to treat Brian Hooker as a suspect. No charges have been filed. No arrest has been made. Brian Hooker has not been charged with any crime. He has repeatedly asserted through counsel that he had no involvement in Lynette's disappearance. Those assertions are part of the record, and the record must state them. But the record also contains the following: court documents from 1999 in which his second wife documented a threat involving an accident and a pattern of physical violence. GPS data from his own vessel that does not match the location he described to authorities. A timeline of his movements after Lynette went missing that contradicts his stated intention to stay in the Bahamas and search for her. And the sworn public account of his stepdaughter, Lynette's daughter Carly, who says her mother told her in 2024 that Brian Hooker choked her and threatened to throw her overboard. Greg Woodfield, who has contacts with Bahamian law enforcement, addressed the state of the investigation from the inside. When the last time he talked to the police in the Bahamas, they are still considering him as a suspect, Woodfield said on record. He also addressed the central obstacle in building the case toward trial. "There is no body," Woodfield said, "which doesn't rule out bringing any charges against someone, but it does actually hamper the investigation. The key physical stuff they've got is that boat. The other stuff is that they would have to bring Brian Hooker in for another talk before they could move on any further." He was interviewed. He was in custody for 5 days in the Bahamas. He had 2 fairly stringent questioning sessions by the Royal Bahamas Police, but after that, they let him go. On the question of whether what Brian Hooker said during those 5 days of Bahamian questioning can be used in a United States court, Tad Tobias offered a careful answer. "In a U.S. court of law, our rules of evidence would apply, not Bahamas," he said. "It would depend on whether he was there voluntarily. He was able to voluntarily give a statement. Was he read any sort of rights? I don't know enough about the Bahamas to know. I know they're an English-based legal system, but I don't know whether he would have had to be read a Miranda-like right or something like that. So that's going to depend on whether that information can be used in a court of law." He confirmed U.S. jurisdiction applies regardless of geography. "My understanding is they are both U.S. citizens," Tobias said, "and U.S. authorities have jurisdiction over crimes happening to U.S. citizens even in other countries." Tobias also addressed the risk of Brian Hooker leaving the country, a concern that has circulated in recent reporting. "I absolutely would have a concern," he said. "We have someone who doesn't reside in the United States. Seemingly he resides on this boat. If you're spending your life riding around on a boat, you're probably doing fairly well. And that would speak to why at the very least I would either want to do a quicker arrest or at least petition a court to say, let's get his passport. We want his passport. We have enough information. Maybe not enough for arrest, although I do think they have enough for an arrest, but petition a court to limit his travel. Greg Woodfield, for his part, addressed what he knows about Hooker's whereabouts based on his reporting. He ostensibly went to California to look after his ailing mother, Woodfield said. He confusingly has two mothers, a stepmother and a biological mother. It's flitting between Grand Rapids and California that I believe he probably has been. But don't forget there is a friend of his reported recently who thinks he may have left the country. Woodfield was precise about what he knows versus what he does not. From the person I talked to, I think it may be more than a rumor that in the last few weeks, he may have been back to Michigan, he said. He apparently has a brother in California who lives slightly off-grid. I obviously can't confirm that, so don't take it as gospel. TikTok. On the question of the route, which has become one of the most significant details in the family's independent reconstruction of events, Woodfield addressed what Carly Allsville has established through her own investigation. She and her partner Steve Hansen have done a lot themselves to try and work out what is going on, Woodfield said. They retraced the route where Brian and Lynette should have gone when they left the Abaco Inn on the dinghy to go to the Soulmate, which was south of the Abaco Inn. Where Brian said the incident happened was actually north of the Abaco Inn. So instead of turning left out of the Abaco Inn to go back to the 50-foot boat, they turned right, and that's where he said it happened. That detail is not a matter of memory or perception. It is a matter of geography. The Soulmate was to the south. Brian Hooker described an incident that occurred to the north. The distance between those two directions is not a small discrepancy in a moment of grief and adrenaline. It is a directional error that cannot be easily explained by disorientation alone. Carly Allsville has also built a partial reconstruction based on surveillance footage from homes along the shoreline facing where the Soulmate was anchored. Cameras captured flashes of light, one at 17 minutes after Brian and Lynette left the Abaco Inn at 7:30 p.m. on April 4th, and another at midnight. Woodfield was careful to characterize this for what it is. She kind of feels that might show there was some activity on the boat, he said, but that's just speculation. What I will say is that anyone who has interviewed her can feel how desperately sorry they are for that woman. There is a photograph of Lynette Hooker that has been circulating widely since her disappearance. It is not a formal portrait. It is not the kind of image that was taken to mark an occasion. It captures her midlife, in light, in motion, in the specific brightness that belongs to a person who is not yet thinking about being looked at. She is smiling. Not for a camera. Not for documentation. Just smiling the way people smile when they are somewhere they chose to be, on a boat they named after the one thing they believe the relationship was built on. That photograph is what this case is actually about. Not the GPS coordinates. Not the personal protection order from 1999. Not the prosecution threshold between probable cause and beyond a reasonable doubt. Those things matter because they are how this story might one day reach a legal conclusion. But the beginning of this story, and the center of it and the reason it matters, is that photograph. A woman who built an extraordinary life on the water. Who had a daughter she called on Fridays. Who left a man she was afraid of, and then went back the way people do when the history is long and the belief that something can be different is stronger than the evidence that it will not. Who was in a dinghy in the dark in the Bahamas on a night in April. And who has not been found. Carly Allsville is still looking. Still asking questions that have not been answered. Still fighting for the kind of closure that does not come from an indictment. That can only come from knowing where her mother is. What happened? That the question is not still open. The investigation continues. The boat stays docked at Fort Lauderdale. The court documents from Michigan are now public. The case is moving. Lynette Hooker remains missing. If there is any information about the whereabouts of Lynette Hooker, about the events aboard the vessel Soulmate on the night of April 4, 2025, or about Brian Hooker's movements before or after that night, contact the Royal Bahamas Police Force, the United States Coast Guard Investigative Service, or the FBI tip line at 1-800-CLL-FBI. Subscribe to Missing People Files for every development in this case as it arrives. The reporting does not stop here. New information is coming, and this channel will be the place it is documented, named sources, confirmed contacts on the record. Every time.